Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira. I am continuing my section on teaching addiction for paper 3, and we start a new section. The section I've numbered, section 3, it just is within the specification. It says explanations for nicotine addiction. Explanations in this particular case, they mean two things. They mean brain neurochemistry, that's one of them, and the other one is learning theory. Now, what is quite clear in terms of the specification is that they expect you to have these two explanations, and within brain neurochemistry, for you to be able to talk about dopamine, and for you to also to talk about cue reactivity within learning theory. Now, before we get into some details about smoking, the explanations, it's probably best for us to start looking at some of the things we do actually know about smoking. Now, this is an old survey from 2006, and what we see here is that there is actually quite a large percentage of British adults who are smokers. We also know that there is actually more men that smoke, and that's more cigarettes. On average, it says here 15 cigarettes are smoked by men compared to 14 by women. So it is likely that we need to consider the image we have there, this idea that there's this fine line between pain and pleasure, because even though 22% of the population do smoke, we see there's quite a large number of respondents who say that they want to give up. And I've seen other studies and more recent kind of data that also talk about roughly about 2/3 of all smokers would like to give up. Now, 22% is about 1 in 5. That particular study was pre the government introducing a kind of law about kind of where you can smoke and how you can smoke and things like that. So I looked up some more recent data, and we see here that it's around about 15% of people who are aged 18 and above smoke. Now, that's quite a significant number of people. We see that that's, over 7 million people in the population smoke on a regular basis, and we could define them as addicted to smoking. Now, of course, what we do find is this trend for it to go down. Back in the 1970s, there's over 50% of men who smoked. And certainly this is my experience growing up in a culture where almost every adult that I knew were smokers, or it was common practice for people to smoke, and including smoking in the car with children. And we see that the trend does go down. So we find that they take kind of surveys, census surveys every 10 years, and the 2011 survey kind of pointed at that 20%, that 22% that we've had a look at previously. Now, moving on to actual explanations, because this is the first part that you can be tested on. What I was trying to do there is just kind of establish that smoking really is an issue. It's a large amount of the population who do smoke, and there's this idea that they don't really want to be smokers anymore. So the first part does say we need to look at brain neurochemistry. And I suppose the major part of this has got to look at this thing called the nuclear accumbens. Okay, we see it's this bit over here. Okay, it's part of a very primitive brain where if you read some of the books that I have read, kind of said that it was really important for us to have the right type of motivation to kind of continue to do things that were difficult, like hunting for food. And certainly the nuclear accumbens is that reward pathway within the brain. And it says here that pretty much nicotine affects this particular part. So what we find is that actually each cigarette doesn't have a lot of nicotine in it. There's only 1 to 2 milligrams in a particular cigarette, but what happens is it's absorbed very, very quickly. There's several ways it can be absorbed in the lining of the mouth, the nose. Obviously, we inhale it into our lungs. And all of these types of things means that the nicotine gets into our system very, very quickly. We see here it takes less than 10 seconds to reach its peak. Okay, so therefore that's how we get nicotine into our system when we smoke cigarettes. Now, well, what is the point of that? Well, we see here that nicotine is positive. Okay, in other words, it is rewarding. Okay, what happens? We have these things called NARCs, and you're welcome to remember the full name, nicotinic acetylchloride receptors. And now these receptors pretty much get filled in the brain and they release dopamine. I'm not very good at my diagrams, but you'll see if you've gone on to some of the websites that I showed you during the introduction to the course, we see how these kind of receptors, these neuroreceptors can be occupied and it releases dopamine. Now, as part of that, it's we also know that the part of the brain that is being triggered is called the ventral tegmental area. Okay, now this is all part of that whole nuclear accumbens part, and we find that ultimately it's all about triggering dopamine. Okay, so we know that dopamine is a very important part of our lives because whenever we receive pleasure, it's due to dopamine being released in us. Now, the thing we have to also acknowledge at this particular point is that there are lots of drugs that do actually trigger this dopamine response. However, the dopamine response in themselves is not any different to the dopamine that could be released in, say, for example, sex or in having a very fulfilling kind of experience, a nice cup of coffee with a friend or with a piece of cake that releases dopamine. But of course, it's all about levels of dopamine, and we find that that particular chemical of nicotine can produce kind of enough dopamine for us to kind of feel pleasure in a significant way. Now, we also know that it's not just simply about a one or two kind of triggering experience. We see that there's another neurotransmitter, this time it's called glutamate, okay, that also gets triggered or released, okay, and this also is another reinforcement of dopamine. So once again, we seem to just repeat that the brain neurochemistry is pretty much dependent on the release of dopamine. So that's the practical mechanism, we could say, related or associated with kind of getting nicotine into the system. However, we need to be able to explain, well, how does the person then become addicted? And this particular paragraph is going to be quite important to us. So what it says here, it is quite literally saying that nicotine that we received from the cigarette activates the area, okay, and then that gives us pleasure. Now, of course, anything that is pleasurable is rewarding, okay? And of course, if something is rewarding, we have this drive to repeat the process that has led it to be rewarding. And of course, that repetition is what leads to addiction. Okay, so that's really important. It's this nicotine activating an area of the brain that receives pleasure. We want to repeat pleasure, so we repeat the behavior, and we have a drive to repeat the behavior, and that is what becomes addictive. So, on a very basic level, that is all that you need to be able to say about the brain neurochemistry and why we become addicted to smoking cigarettes. Okay, because cigarettes have a very simple and easy way of releasing nicotine into the system. However, if we want to take it to the next step, we could also talk about, okay, so it's not just the receiving of nicotine, we also have what we call this regulation model. So regulation model is kind of how things kind of fit in. We will hopefully recognize that anything that is placed within our body has to at some stage be removed. Okay, that we have to have some kind of process which breaks down nicotine. And we find that that actually happens very quickly. So obviously there are some drugs that will last in the system for a long time. However, we believe that nicotine actually gets metabolized really quickly. And of course, once the nicotine is being removed, this then kicks up a craving to replace the nicotine within our system. Now, the reason this is because we want to avoid withdrawal. So, of course, we've taught this course where we have separate components. Of course, and the first component was this idea of dependency and withdrawal and tolerance and things like that. Okay, but they can't really be separated in real life. What we find is, of course, as we build up that tolerance, as we become dependent, the cravings kick in because we now have a body that is expecting the nicotine to be part of the metabolic process. Okay, so therefore, what we're ultimately creating is some kind of vicious circle, and it says here a circle of short-term pleasure and impending withdrawal. So for many addicts, actually, the reason that they become addicts is not because of the substance in their body, but more the fact that as the substance becomes part of kind of how their body is functioning, there's a cycle of where they kind of start feeling withdrawal, that they start feeling, if I don't have this drug in my system, I'm really not going to feel very, very good. Okay, so there's fear of that my body is going to kind of punish me for not having nicotine in the system. So what is obvious then is that if a smoker is not smoking, so if it takes, if they stop because of circumstances, for example, if you are a smoker and you come to school, you can't smoke in school. So if you have a time period and the drug has been metabolized, it disappears from the body, okay, you're going to kind of feel kind of anxious and you want to replace nicotine in your body. But actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that because the receptors that were fill, okay, so these NARCs that were fill by the nicotine, they start to kind of have the nicotine breakdown and they become available again. Okay, so they start functioning normal, and we said that they are sensitized. So therefore, they're ready to receive more kind of nicotine, ready to kind of make the person feel kind of better. Okay, now we have an official term for this. It's called upregulation. So it's kind of like a really basic kind of idea. Your body is expecting nicotine. It fills the particular receptors. The body metabolizes the nicotine, and then of course it's now freeing up those receptors in order to kind of feel the sensation again. And at the same time, your body is experiencing withdrawal. And of course, the easiest way to kind of feel better again is to put nicotine back into those receptors. And so it says here that we're kind of feeling kind of anxiety or agitation as the expectation is we want those particular receptor sites to be kind of ready. Okay, now this could explain why for many smokers that after say a good night's sleep or even a bad night's sleep, their bodies are kind of more receptive to kind of receiving nicotine, and they often kind of report that those first kind of cigarettes in the morning are often kind of really quite kind of more rewarding than other times. Okay, So now what we do say about the regulation model, or the upregulation or downregulation model, is that ultimately it just teaches us to be motivated, ultimately to avoid kind of displeasure, or it says here unpleasurable psychological and physiological withdrawal states. Okay, and the easiest way to avoid that is simply to fill those receptors up with nicotine. Okay, and that's what I said previously about smokers pretty much enjoying that first kind of cigarette after periods of abstinence, because their bodies are kind of ready and wanting and waiting for the cigarette. So because it was a cycle, of course, there's repetition of this particular cycle, of this process over time. And ultimately, what we could also then say is that the brain becomes desensitized to this whole process, because it's kind of something which happens repeatedly. That's why they use the word chronic. And of course, your chronic smoker, or the person who smokes every day, pretty much has a increased tolerance and therefore increases the intake of nicotine. So what is quite interesting at this particular time is that there is some belief that it causes permanent changes to the brain neurochemistry. Okay, and so you can see from this image here that we have pretty much kind of your brain gets rewired to pretty much expect to have those receptors full. Now, of course, that's quite compelling. Biology is always quite compelling, makes perfect sense, and hence why a lot of psychology has moved towards biological explanations, and as such is kind of what we do. But I kind of want to also then talk about both the research support for this, and also to kind of for us to think deeper, because if we're going to write an essay or write some kind of evaluation, we need to think deeper. On a very, very basic level, there's always going to be quite a lot of evidence to support the biological model. Okay, and I just simply have a few pieces of research. You can use any one of them. I wouldn't recommend you use more than one of them, but certainly any one of them can help us support this idea that our brains are kind of hardwired for smoking. Now, I've also tried to be quite interesting and look at the different ones that we have for this. So the first one just literally is interesting research, because it wasn't research on smoking, it was research on this epilepsy drug. Okay, so what it did is reduce the surge of dopamine in the NOx. Okay, and what happens, it also at the same time reduced addiction to nicotine. Okay, so if it pretty much kind of takes that biological component out of the addiction process, people are less likely to want to kind of smoke cigarettes. Okay, we have another piece of research. Once again, it wasn't looking at smokers, it was looking at schizophrenia patients. Now, we don't do the schizophrenia topic, but what we do know is that one of the models for trying to explain schizophrenia is this idea of kind of this hyper dopamine model, where they say that schizophrenics have kind of too much dopamine within the system. Okay, so in order to help with schizophrenia, we often give them this drug called haloperidol. Okay, and it's a dopamine antagonist. Okay, so an antagonist is often kind of the enemy within a particular novel. Okay, so what it does is the opposite of what dopamine does. Okay, so it kind of stops dopamine from working. However, as a side effect, these particular schizophrenic patients who are kind of used to dopamine, who want dopamine within their systems, they still have to find another way of getting dopamine into the system. And of course, what they do is keep smoking to get dopamine in the system. I think this is a fantastic idea that we see a side effect of some other research is kind of why often schizophrenics are kind of so dependent on smoking. Now, the last one that I have said these are just pure research support paragraphs where we're saying, look, there is a link between the brain neurochemistry and smoking, and this is the research that shows us this. And possibly in some ways the most compelling aspect of all of this is that if you are able to take some kind of brain imaging, okay, and you'll see quite literally the reward system being triggered in a smoker as they smoke cigarettes. So clearly it's important for us to kind of acknowledge that nicotine is rewarding for our bodies. But this is not the whole picture. Let's start looking a little bit deeper and start being critical, because that's what we're expected to do when we write an evaluation. It's not about points, it's about thinking about, we have this idea that smoking is explained purely by this by this brain neurochemistry. So let's look at some of the other points. So I have a limitation. So now I have a question or an element where I'm saying there is a problem with this. So it says here, it neglects other determining factors. And this is just a fancy way of saying, hang on, could it actually be something else other than the biology? Because if you think about it, we can get nicotine into our system really easily. We've got lots of ways of getting nicotine into our system, but people want to smoke cigarettes. So because it's neglecting other factors, because it's kind of not looking at the big picture, I have said here is it's reductionist. Now the whole explanation of reductionism will be further explained when Ms. Harries goes through your issues and debates. But the very gist of reductionism is that it says that we take a complex understanding of addiction, of smoking addiction, and we reduce it purely down to body chemistry, what's going on in the brain. And we say that the person becomes an addict just because of that. Okay, so there could be other factors that could actually explain the addiction, not the body chemistry. So let's have a look at some of those other factors. So it says here, it's possible that other determining factors such as social, okay, or psychological could actually be the reason why somebody smokes. Now, this doesn't say that, okay, it's not biology. What it's saying is that biology is reductionist. It's too simple. There are other reasons why we smoke. Now, in order to try and work on a point like this, we do perhaps need to go a little bit deeper. So going a little bit deeper is we have this particular study by Choi et al. Okay, and what it looks at is kind of why do adolescents become dependent? So why do adolescents become dependent on smoking? Okay, and what it found was that it was not about just biology, it was about other things. So social factors like friends who smoke. We also have psychological ideas of things like they were underachieving in school. Okay, and so therefore we have this idea that potentially the reason they smoke is not down to the biology, but actually down to these other factors. Adding just a bit more detail to this, and of course, if I add furthermore, it means I could have ended my point on the previous page, but I decided to go a little bit deeper here. Okay, there are some people, and I kind of chose not to give too much detail of this, but there are some people who have said that, unlike what I've said kind of previously about this idea of having kind of a smoker's brain, it says there does not appear to be a marked change in the nicotine receptors that would characterize biological tolerance. So, in other words, the brain doesn't change as dramatically as it would potentially for other drugs. Okay, that it could well actually be more psychological rather than biological. So it says this means the biologic explanation is inadequate. And possibly also leads on to a very good kind of idea that there must be other reasons why people potentially become smokers. And I am a firm believer that for some people, their dependence on smoking is social, their dependence on smoking is often to do with kind of habit forming or learning. Okay, so if you look at kind of this idea that if I want to fit in, that I potentially join a group of people who kind of smoke. When I became a teacher and we're doing teacher training, unlike things are today where we're really friendly to trainee teachers and we appreciate that it's a difficult enough job, there's quite a lot of hostility between trainee teachers and kind of qualified teachers. And what we had was a staff room often divided, and there was always a group of smokers in one corner, and kind of the rest of the staff room were non-smokers. So when I trained in a particularly difficult school, I found that it was actually the smokers that were a lot more friendly, a lot more accepting, and certainly helpful in my training. So you could argue that I could have had that social pressure to fit in. If I was joining them and they were smoking, I would join in with them. I've also seen this in some of my family, potentially, if you come from a family of smokers, that's not necessarily biological, that's kind of social pressure to smoke. Okay, so this is a great point to argue about other factors. Please get your head around it, think about it, what it means, because of course the next explanation is about learning theory. So there we have it. That's the end of the first part of explaining smoking using specifically brain neurochemistry. And in the next video, I'll go through the learning theory. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will be speaking to you soon.